As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So in the wake of French President Emmanuel Macron's comments about Western countries not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine, a European official speaking to Financial Times pointed out that Western Special Operations Forces are already in the country. So this official, who is described as a senior European defense official, said, quote, "Everybody knows there are Western special forces in Ukraine. They've just not acknowledged it officially," end quote. And we do know that there are special forces in Ukraine because of the Discord leaks, which revealed last year that as of March 2023, there were 97 NATO special operations soldiers in Ukraine, including 14 Americans and 50 British soldiers. So the British had the biggest presence there. And this leak confirmed earlier reporting from The Intercept that said U.S. special operations forces were on the ground along with CIA operatives. And there was also earlier reporting that said British soldiers were on the ground in Ukraine. So we don't know, again, the Discord leaks, that was as of March 2023, which was a year ago at this point. So we don't know if that number has gone up, gone down, stayed the same. But this is confirmation from this European official that they are still there in some capacity. And Macron's comments also drew attention to the tens of thousands of foreign fighters who joined Ukraine's Foreign Legion. So the Washington Post had a report about that. And it said, I didn't realize this, that at least 50 American citizens have been killed fighting in Ukraine. 50 Americans. I wasn't aware that it was that high. French officials have insisted that Macron was not talking about sending a large number of troops to fight in Ukraine, suggesting that he was talking about training missions. Many NATO members distanced themselves from the remarks and said that they were not planning to send troops, but Macron received support from Lithuania, which said it was discussing sending troops for training. So Lithuania's defense minister said, quote, "We are talking about sending training missions, instructors. The decisions would be made on a multilateral basis," end quote. What they're playing with here is this risk of a Russia-NATO war, direct war, that could quickly turn nuclear. Representative Hakeem Jeffries, he's a Democrat from New York, and he's the top Democrat in the House. He has suggested that Democrats would protect House Speaker Mike Johnson from being ousted if he brought the $95 billion foreign military aid bill to the floor for a vote. So the situation, as things are right now, that $95 billion bill, which includes $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion to support Israel's slaughter of Palestinians. I know $4.8 billion for Taiwan and other related spending. And then there's also $3 billion for the AUKUS military pact between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. That's passed through the Senate. If it's brought to a vote in the House, it'll pass. There's enough support there. But some Republicans have threatened to oust Johnson as Speaker if he holds a vote on the bill, and it would only take one Republican to file a motion to vacate the speakership, which would bring about a vote to oust him. So that's what happened to Kevin McCarthy. Matt Gaetz filed this motion to vacate, and he was ousted because every single Democrat voted against him, and 8 Republicans voted against him. The rest of the Republicans voted for him to stay. So if the Democrats decided to protect McCarthy, he would still be in. So Jeffries is saying that some Democrats may be willing to promise to vote to keep Johnson as Speaker if he moves forward with this $95 billion monstrosity. So Jeffries said, quote, "It does seem to me, based on informal conversations, that were Speaker Johnson to do the right thing relative to meeting the significant national security needs of the American people by putting it on the floor for a vote, there will be a reasonable number of people in the House Democratic Caucus who will take the position that he should not fall as a result," end quote. It's really amazing how he phrased that, what he's calling this foreign military aid bill, the national security needs of the American people, when it's going to go to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and all these other places. So France has rejected a call from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to give $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds to Ukraine. And that's, a step that would amount to outright theft. It would be a big escalation of the U.S. economic war against Russia. So Janet Yellen claimed, as I covered yesterday, that there was a legal case to support handing the funds to Ukraine to fund the proxy war and future reconstruction. But French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said that there was no legal case to be made. He said, or maybe he didn't say there was no legal case to be made. He said it was not sufficient. He said, quote, "We don't think this legal basis is sufficient. This legal basis must be accepted not only by European countries, not only by the G7 countries, but by all the member states of the world community. And I mean by all the member states of the G20. We should not add any kind of division among the G20 countries," end quote. And that's going to be very hard because Russia is part of the G20. So the EU is moving forward with a plan to set up a fund for Ukraine using profits made by the frozen Russian money, which Lemaire pointed out. The U.S. has welcomed the plan, but they want the EU to go further. And they need Europe to be on board because European banks hold $200 billion of the Russian funds. The U.S. has about $67 billion. So, the thinking here is definitely they're struggling to get this money, Congress to authorize this spending. So this is something that they're thinking, okay, we have all this Russian money. Let's just use that. Let's just send that to Ukraine. And Russia has warned that it has ways to respond if the U.S. and its allies go ahead and send the Russian funds to Ukraine.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
An article coming out tomorrow. It says, as the pre-trial hearings in the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others who are charged with masterminding the 9/11 attacks proceed at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba, the government continues to stumble with its own witnesses. In hearings last week, government lawyers tried to demonstrate that statements the defendants made to CIA and FBI agents were voluntary. When the government's principal torturer, a retired psychologist, had difficulty recalling that during a torture session, he threatened one of his victims by offering to slit the throat of the victim's young son, and that he had recounted that threat under oath in previous testimony, it became apparent to all in the courtroom and those of us who monitor these awful proceedings that the government was encountering a strange and unexpected difficulty in defending the behavior of its torturers.
When George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Lindsey Graham, yes, same Lindsey Graham, concocted the Devil's Island and kangaroo court system on Guantanamo Bay, the Supreme Court invalidated the kangaroo court system and ordered that all trials be legitimate, real trials. They engaged in torture for a while in foreign countries and then eventually at Guantanamo Bay itself. It wasn't until the FBI arrived that the FBI said, if you don't stop the torture, you're going to leave in handcuffs because we're not allowed to participate in this and we're required to arrest people that do it. To the credit of the FBI, of which you and I have been harshly critical when they exceed their authority, they did the right thing on the torture. Nevertheless, they did interrogate these people who had been tortured. The government wants to use what these people said in Thailand during the torture sessions and afterwards in Guantanamo Bay after the torture had stopped. The government wants to use both sets of statements against them. It is the obligation of the government then to prove that both sets of statements, what was said under torture and what was said afterwards a year later in Guantanamo Bay, in some cases several years later, was so infected by torture or was voluntary and therefore can be used. In its efforts to demonstrate this, it puts the torturer in chief on. I'm sorry to say I've met this creep because he was lauded by my then colleagues and friends at Fox News as a great American for having concocted these medieval tortures, the means of which I outlined briefly without getting too graphic in the article. It's a horrible, despicable human being who's been sued many, many times and keeps managing to evade liability for what he did. But nevertheless, the government put him on the witness stand as a government witness to testify what happened 20 years ago when, bingo, he doesn't remember. He doesn't remember. And then they showed him, wait a minute, you testified to this 4 years ago. You told us that you threatened to slit the son's throat. I don't remember. Here's your testimony from 4 years ago. Oh, yeah, I guess I did say it. Then they put a female FBI agent who was on there for the whole time, 5 years of all this interrogation. In one afternoon cross-examination, she said, mimicking Hillary Clinton in the famous pink dress interview, I don't recall, 199 times. Now the government's going, well, how can we possibly prove that the statements made under torture were voluntary if the torturer and the interrogator don't even remember what happened? Well, of course they remember. They don't want to be held liable for it by stating under oath that they recall what happened.
And how about you mentioned here that you talked about, you don't want to talk about what they've done to this guy, that Mohammed and others were violently tortured as various so-called CIA black sites outside the United States. They were raped, hanged by their wrists for weeks inside large refrigerators, beaten with fists and wooden boards, waterboarded, whereby water was forced into their nasal cavities so as to create the perception of suffocation and drowning. Then you go on to say that many of the records, all of this was destroyed by CIA officials, a crime for which no one has been prosecuted. Now, wasn't this woman who was a CIA person?
Oh, Bloody Gina.
Brought in?
Yes.
Is that the person?
Yeah. Bloody Gina's records were not destroyed. Bloody Gina's records were actually exposed by reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post, who got their hands on, I don't know how, on the summaries of the torture. You know, there have been so many different sets of torture. Bloody Gina was not involved in torturing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but she was involved in torturing others, and she wrote graphic reports back to her bosses in Langley. And lest you think this Bloody Gina thing was a joke, her nickname was given to her by her colleagues, and it's one of the reasons she was appointed director of the CIA by a president who loved when he heard that that was her nickname, Donald Trump.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Next up, we've got Rand Paul talking about you know what? Let's watch it first.
So I travel to Washington every week from Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I live, and then I return at the end of the week. And I've been married 33 years as of last week. And I get home and I think, you know, when I knock on the door, my wife lets me in, I think, well, she'll have my slippers, maybe a hug and a kiss, maybe a martini. And you know what I usually get when I get home? I open the door and you know what she says to me? How come Anthony Fauci's not in jail yet?
How hot is Rand Paul's wife? Tell me that doesn't get you juiced up for your lady, where she's like, you can't come back into this house until you've completed your mission of getting Fauci into jail. And I think that Fauci going to jail would be cleansing for this nation, because as I argue with relatives at meals who have just gone on from the COVID thing, they still think the vaccines were a good idea. I'd like something more in their face, a better receipt to go, I was right, you were wrong. I would like that satisfaction. I would like to actually see, and that's the problem with these old people in office. That's why you only get power when you're really old, is so that you get so old that people are like, yeah, can't we just let this slide? The guy's an old person. That's why everyone in office should be capped at 85, so that we don't feel bad prosecuting them. Let's continue.
But it's not for lack of trying. I've referred him twice to the Department of Justice, but there is this guy over there, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who may be the most partisan Attorney General we've had. There used to be some sense of distance between the Attorney General and presidents in politics, but I think there is no longer. And we have the proof. We'd submitted the proof. Essentially, Anthony Fauci, in his own words, has admitted the truth. He lied in Congress, which is a felony, and we have the proof. It's in his own emails. It's in his own words. But if you look back in time and you want to know when the cover-up began, when the conspiracy began, it really began January 31st of 2020. The virus had only been out a couple weeks in China. The Chinese were still saying, oh, it's not transmitted between humans. This was months after the virus had really erupted. We know now that the virus started in the lab, that the first 3 people sick, we actually know their names, worked in a lab in Wuhan. They worked for Dr. Xi, the one they call the great bat scientist. The first patient 0 they actually think is Ben Hugh, a scientist who worked for. We know that because they declassified that in the Trump administration. They declassified that these 3 were sick. The X-ray findings were consistent with COVID. It wasn't a test for COVID. They had a test for the first SARS-1, the one that was the pandemic back in 2003 and 2004, but they didn't yet have a COVID test. But they had all the signs and symptoms of it. Will we ever prove they had it? Well, we could have early on in the disease if they'd come forward and admitted the truth and subjected serum for antibody analysis. We could have proved that they were the first patients. But all of the evidence points to that. We know the Chinese were dishonest in their death count. All likelihood, millions of people died in China, and yet there was no real accounting for that.
There we go. Rand Paul laying out the facts, telling us that he's still on the case. And hopefully, if Donald Trump gets into office, we'll have a new AG. They actually will prosecute Donald Trump, but will prosecute Fauci. But I think we all know that is not going to happen. Not that Trump won't win, but my guess is even if he does, he will just move on from it because he doesn't want to revisit his own failures of letting the guy remain in office. This one's wild. We've been talking about how at the beginning of the Ukraine war, we banished Russia from our payment systems. And what we've done is we let people know that they might not have access to our currency. And did we have a leading position where everyone's using our currency, we're able to rob them of our wealth, we're able to ship them our inflation, and are we weakening the United States by creating more incentives for people to, rely and utilize different currencies? Have we ruined the status of the U.S. dollar as the now oil contracts are being priced into other currencies? And so Janet Yellen's taking it even further, where the billions of dollars that have been seized of Russian assets that I guess were in American banks, she's saying we should hand this to the Ukraine. The Ukraine's in a war with Russia. Russia's done tremendous damage to the Ukraine in this illegal war. So maybe we should just give them those funds, which long term would probably be a pretty terrible escalation in terms of people not wanting to keep money with us. And then lastly, you've got presidents going down to visit the border. You've got Biden going down to where the wall actually exists to go, everything's fine here, man. I don't know what everyone's complaining about. It's pretty great out here. All right. And then we had one more topic I wanted to get into. Supreme Court weighs bump stock ban. I thought this one was pretty funny. So the guy who was arguing for why people need the bump stocks, once again, I think, you should be the guns are to keep the government in check. That we should be allowed to have all the guns and there shouldn't be any restrictions on them. Shouldn't have to go get a permit. Saying, hey, a permit because we need to make sure reasonable safety. Well, who gets to define reasonable? I don't know. If a government can't force everyone to even get an ID to vote because it's racist to get them IDs, well, then what's the process for reasonableness or swiftness that government's not impeding my constitutional right to bear a gun? I mean, I live in Connecticut. I have to get them. They got to take my teeth. I got to take a phone call with the person, I think the highest paid person in the state, and he's got to screen me, talk to me about my relationship with the neighborhood. I got to go take some classes. I should be able to just walk into a store, buy a gun, and be done with it. What right does government have to stop me from what the Constitution allowed me to do? But anyways, in this case, I thought this lawyer made a bad argument, and I thought the response was pretty funny, so I'll give it a read. Besides, he said bump stocks could have uses other than enabling machine gun-like fire. For instance, they can help people with disabilities, such as those who have arthritis in their fingers or otherwise might lack the ability to fire multiple rounds of ammunition. Why, asked Justice Sonia Sotomayor, would Congress think a person with arthritis needs to shoot 400 to 700 8-hour rounds of ammunition under any circumstance? She has a good point. I mean, the entire conversation is backwards because I shouldn't have to prove to you why I should be allowed to do something that the Constitution said I was allowed to do. But this guy did pick a pretty bad example of, well, if you limit the power of the Constitution, people with arthritis won't be able to shoot machine guns. And she's like, well, do people with arthritis need to shoot machine guns? I mean, the answer is, I guess, why should people with arthritis not be allowed to shoot machine guns? And can you defend your removing of their rights? But for me to put forward, hey, you need to change this law so that people with arthritis can shoot machine guns, not the most convincing of arguments.
The Peter Schiff Show.
I was watching on CNBC, and they're talking about this very topic, about how few stocks are going up and how almost all the gains are concentrated in this small group of stocks. And the commentator said, well, you don't really have to worry about it because it's happened before, right? It's not like this is unprecedented. We've seen this before. And they went over the 1960s with the Nifty 50 stocks, Xerox and Polaroid and stuff like that. And they said, well, it happened back then. And then they talked about the 1990 tech bubble, .com bubble, and said, well, it happened in the 1990s. And it happened in the 1960s, so we don't have to worry about it. It's happening again. Yeah, they conveniently overlooked what happened next. They forgot about the 1970s, where stocks got killed, right? The Nifty 50 blew up. Wasn't so nifty. The Dow was at 1,000 in 1966, and it was still at 1,000 in 1982. That's a long time to wait while inflation eviscerated the value of your money. Same thing with the tech bubble of the 1990s. That didn't end well. The market crashed. The NASDAQ was down 80% in the early 2000s. So the two periods of time that they said were similar to the one that we have right now ended in disaster for equities. At the same time, they're saying we don't have to worry about it because it happened before. We do have to worry about it because it did happen before, and look what followed. But the thing is, the economy is in so much worse shape now than it was in 1970 or 2000. We have a much bigger debt bubble. In fact, I looked at the national debt clock today. It's now above 34.4 trillion, so headed for 35 trillion. We're now adding about 200 billion a month because it's been 2 months and we've increased the national debt by 400 billion. So it's a little bit slower pace than we were at. We were at a faster pace. We were clocking in at like 4 trillion a year. So that's slowed down. If you annualize the last 2 months, that's 2.6 trillion in debt for the year, which is still a lot bigger than the official deficit estimates, which are a little under 2 trillion. But the real number is not what they estimate, but what's actually happening. Again, you just have to look at the national debt. However much it goes up, that's the budget deficit. no matter what they claim. So if they claim we have a $2 trillion budget deficit, but the national debt goes up by $3 trillion, they borrowed $3 trillion. That's the actual deficit, not what they're pretending it is. But they, for political reasons, they don't count a lot of stuff. It's like sometimes corporations report their earnings and there's this extraordinary items and we exclude this, we exclude that. And so these are our earnings that we're reporting, but they're not the actual earnings. Well, the government does the same thing with the budget. They have a bunch of items that they say, well, these are extraordinary. They're just, we're not going to count this. We're not going to count that. And so we're just going to count the things that we want to count. And we're going to ignore all the things that we don't want to count. Well, you can't ignore it. If you spent it, you spent it. The national debt goes up. It doesn't care if you meant to spend that money or not, or whether or not it was an out of the ordinary event. We still have to pay the money back. But the other disingenuous part of the process is every year we have the same events that they say are extraordinary and they're not recurring, except they happen every year. Right? So if we're spending money on the same stuff year after year after year, you can't keep saying to ignore it because it's an extraordinary expense. It's not if it's recurring. Right? Now maybe it's not the identical expense like natural disasters. Every time they have relief for a natural disaster, they don't count that. So if there's a hurricane, if there's wildfires, if there's an earthquake, whatever, a flood, and they spend the money, they say, well, that's off budget because, it was for a flood. Yeah, except every year there's a different flood or there's a different fire. So you can't just ignore the fact that every single year the government is spending all this money on disaster relief and claim it's not part of the budget. It is. I mean, you got to admit it. This stuff's going to happen every year. But so the government does this, so the whole thing is a lie. But I think that we're going to start to pick up the pace of these deficits because a lot more debt is coming due this year. And as that low-yielding debt matures, we're talking where the government borrowed at 10 basis points, 25 basis points, 1%. All that stuff, all those 1 year, 3 year, 5 year notes that are coming due this year and now have to be rolled over at 400 basis points, 425 basis points, 500 basis points, right? That's going to add considerably to the national debt. So these numbers are going to rise faster. The economy is going to weaken. Unemployment, I think, has turned. We're starting to see that in the numbers. So we're going to get more people collecting unemployment. We're going to have fewer people paying taxes. More minimum wage hikes are going into effect this year. I was reading more about California. They've got a $20 minimum wage now for fast food workers. So a lot of fast food workers in California are going to lose their jobs. A lot of fast food restaurants are going to go out of business. I read that they actually made an exemption in the law that said if you're a fast food restaurant but you bake your own bread, that you're exempt. Now, why did they do that? Well, apparently Panera Bread, the company, was a major contributor, big donor to the governor of California, who a lot of people think is going to be the presidential nominee, right? A lot of money was given to Gavin Newsom's campaign from Panera Bread, and so he's stuck in an exemption that says everybody has to pay the minimum wage, $20 minimum wage, unless you happen to bake bread, which is like, oh, Panera Bread bakes the bread. Now, the first thing I thought of when I saw this is, all right, well, why doesn't McDonald's just start baking their buns? I mean, it's got to be cheaper than paying everybody $20 an hour. And I tweeted that out, and somebody replied to my tweet and said, but in the law, it says it only applies to companies that were baking bread in 2023. So you can't just start baking bread. You had to have already been baking your bread. So clearly that means it's not about bakeries. It's about Panera Bread. It's about rewarding somebody who made a big contribution to your campaign.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Unfortunately, and, to some extent, understandably, they're going to completely misdiagnose the problem. They'll think it's, quote, the system, which in effect, it is the system. It's just they're going to identify the wrong system as being the culprit. And this has been an issue. This has been a problem with the Fed since it was created, that the Fed creates all kinds of instability, creates bubbles, it creates prices that are out of whack. It artificially, for example, the whole war sector of the economy is made possible by the Fed. So it blows up parts of the economy that wouldn't exist at that size. And people think that's capitalism. And yet no one says, but the Fed is doing this. What are the consequences of what the Fed is doing? That's just so off the table. So the Fed causes all this mischief and the market economy gets the blame.
Well, and let's also lay some of the blame at the feet of economists themselves, professional economists, academic economists, because their entire job as social scientists is in part to help us understand the unseen, the seen and the unseen. We're all familiar with that concept. Of course, Per Byland wrote a book with that title, The Seen and the Unseen, because it's very easy for a young person They become disillusioned with, let's say, their job prospects, their student loan debt, their housing availability, all these kind of things. And to look at the landscape and say, well, I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders or something like that. I want student loan forgiveness. I want rent control. I want free. I want food stamps. I want free health care. I want to go to grad school for free. I mean, you can understand why people would gravitate towards this mindset, because that's the scene. It's very easy for government to take money or borrow money or print money and create some of these scene effects and say, okay, we're going to build a housing subdivision for poor people. That's going to be brick and mortar. You can see that. So a brick and mortar housing development, let's say built by a city government in a place like Chicago, that's visible to people. They can see that. They can understand that someone can actually live in it. But what they can't see and understand so easily is the opportunity costs of that money or those taxes or that debt to the city and what else could have been done in the marketplace. So it's a real problem for those of us who are more in the Austrian or libertarian side of things to explain to people the second and third order effects of what the Fed does. And what we really have to understand, and I think this goes so unbelievably unremarked, is how unusual the last 4 decades have been in human history. If you look at the period from roughly 1982 to 2022, across not only the United States, but really across the West, central banks pushed interest rates down and down and down, not in a linear fashion, but generally speaking, over 40 years. So what does that do? What happens when you spend 4 decades making credit cheaper than it otherwise would be, at least in our opinion, in the view of a lot of critics of the Fed? What happens when the most important price in the economy, the price of borrowing money or the price of saving, is, I'm not going to say set by a central bank, I'm going to say it's targeted and influenced by a central bank. What happens? I mean, that's the question that David Stockman asks in The Great Deformation. And I would argue that what happens is actually very profound, that saving becomes less and less attractive to people, borrowing becomes more and more attractive to people, and that filters out, that flows through the economy in ways which are just absolutely remarkable, in ways we don't think about too much. Maybe people buy that BMW instead of that Ford Taurus because interest rates are low and they can get a 0 or 1% car loan. You can't get that today, but you could a while back. Maybe they live in a fancier, larger house than they otherwise would. Maybe they take vacations in Europe instead of driving to the Grand Canyon. Maybe they send their kids to a more expensive college than they otherwise would, because anybody can get a student loan. It's really remarkable if we start to think about the cultural and social ramifications of monetary and fiscal policy beyond just the economics of it. And, there have been some attempts to touch on this. Obviously, Guido Hulsmann wrote a book, The Ethics of Money Production, which is really fascinating. Yeah. I'd love to see that updated to account for, the moral hazards surrounding the 2008 bailouts and for the unbelievable, extraordinary monetary and fiscal policy that accompanied COVID in 2020. I mean, the rent moratoriums, not from the Housing Authority, but from the CDC. I mean, what does that mean when you tell people that they don't have to pay their rent for an extended period, that they don't have to pay interest on their student loans or mortgages for an extended period? How does that moral hazard flow through the economy? What does it mean to landlords? What does it mean to the so-called rule of law? When you purchase, let's say, a townhouse or a condominium as a rental property for extra income, thinking that, well, if I don't get paid rent in my town, I can go to the local court system, use the eviction process, and have the people out, let's say, within a month at not too much legal expense to myself, and I can fix it up and rent it again. I mean, that's a presumption. We all think of contracts in America as something that are enforced. But what happens when a rent moratorium comes along because of a virus, because of flu virus? I mean, the ramifications of that are going to be huge. We're already seeing that. We're already seeing a lot of individuals getting out of the owning housing, especially the Airbnb and VRBO market. And we're seeing larger corporate players, the boogeymen like BlackRock, coming in and purchasing up more of that housing stock. So we have to, I think, view this stuff through a cultural and social lens, not just the lens of economics or finance. I also think we'll benefit from that, because I think the left does a very good job of coming at things from an emotive angle, from tugging on the heartstrings, from making populist arguments. And I think the libertarian right has shied away from that. And really what's going on both the fiscal and monetary side, it isn't just harmful to the economy, it's evil. It's contrary to human nature, to the whole thrust of human civilization, which is capital accumulation and cultural accumulation over decades. And when we start to mess with that, when we start to encourage people through policy to basically consume material and cultural capital rather than build it and save it, we're in trouble. And we're not just in trouble economically, we're in trouble, I would argue, morally.
Anyway, I want to go through a couple of quick things. This week, looks like they're going to be voting on the supplemental budget. If you remember, around the first of the year, they said, okay, we'll put in a stopgap It'll last us a few weeks. Let's get these appropriations bills out. Let's do our actual job in Congress, and then we'll move on. Well, guess what? They didn't do that. They had to kick Santos out. They had to pass about 1,000 resolutions saying how wonderful Israel is. They had to do all sorts of things, but except their job. And so now they're back in the bind again. They're saying, we got to do a stopgap. We've got to keep things going. We don't want to shut down. No one wants a government shutdown. Well, a lot of us do, actually. So here's Thomas Massie, our great friend, a great friend of liberty. He is on the board of the Ron Paul Institute. He put out a tweet yesterday, and it says, the first installment of the omnibus is allegedly coming up for a vote next week. They've been writing this behemoth behind closed doors for weeks. If just 1/3 of U.S. representatives will oppose it, we can stop this monstrosity. So it's ready. It's coming. They've been writing it in secret. This is something that they're doing more and more of. They present, and Senator Mike Lee says this a lot, and I had a tweet. I should have clipped it, but he's complaining. He's saying the next GOP leader in the Senate should stop doing this stuff in secret. And that's, I think, a very, very good argument. So now here's an article from, I think it is Politico. I could be wrong. I didn't clip it. But so this is what's going to happen. Both chambers, yeah, it is Politico. Both chambers only have a couple of days to pass this stopgap before a partial government shutdown kicks in on Saturday. I think they may be actually voting on it today. And there's still a few hiccups on that point. Now, Speaker Johnson will almost certainly need help from Democrats to pass the measure in the House. Now, we will remember that Speaker McCarthy was defenestrated for his threat to use Democrats to help pass more aid bills. It looks like Johnson's going to have to do that which McCarthy was so robustly denounced for doing. So if you go to the next one, here's why he's going to have to need help. And here's Massie giving us some hope. He says, if 145 out of the 220 Republicans vote against it, we can stop it. They plan to suspend the rules to pass this, which means they need a 2/3 majority. Now, this you're seeing increasingly happening in the House. And Johnson did it a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, on aid to Israel. He suspended the rules, which means you go around the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is very powerful, and Thomas Massie happens to be on that Rules Committee. That's one of the deals he made when he decided to support Speaker McCarthy. A very smart deal on the part of Massie, and there are a few others. So they go around the Rules Committee, they bring it directly to the floor. This technique was originally, or it is intended for quote-unquote non-controversial bills. So by going around the Rules Committee, sneaking around the back, okay, but you have to have a 2/3 majority to pass that, and that's going to be tricky. So Massie's saying, we got to get 145 Republicans. So even if all the Democrats jump on board with this stopgap, they need to get 145 Republicans, so that will deprive them of the 2/3 majority. So keep an eye out for that coming up maybe today. I didn't look this morning. Maybe today that vote will be coming up and is very important. I want to do a final update on the war front. Yesterday we talked a little bit about France's Macron saying, hey, let's go in to Ukraine. Let's send troops. Well, it didn't go over very well. And this is an interesting, I would say, shot across the bow, an interesting rebuttal from the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. He revealed something that people are not that happy about. Probably the worst kept secret, but nevertheless, a head of state saying it. Put on that next one. British soldiers helping fire Ukrainian missiles, Olaf Scholz reveals. The German Chancellor is criticized for flagrant abuse of intelligence that could endanger UK personnel on the ground and help the Russians. So that's how they frame it. Endanger UK personnel on the ground. Well, of course, if they are acting in their military capacity in Ukraine, well, of course they're targets. And it's obvious. This shouldn't be a surprise. Here's another article about it. I think this is from the Daily Mail. Germany is accused of being completely irresponsible after claiming British troops are helping Ukraine fire missiles at Putin's forces. So like stop and sort of breathe that in for a second. British military personnel, whether they're active duty or quote unquote retired and retained, are in Ukraine firing missiles at Russia. And the only concern among the mainstream media is, how dare he reveal this? Rather than how dare they send troops? Are they insane? Do they want World War III? No, well, there's the media for you. So the final thing I wanted to do, as you know, the U.S. has been involved in keeping the Red Sea safe and open for international shipping. We know, we've talked about on the show, that has not gone as well as planned. It's not Deus Vult. You can't just will it. This goes back to the neocons. You can't just will something to happen and have it happen. Every now and again in life, you come across a Houthi situation, right? Where the underdog actually hits you with something asymmetric that you didn't plan for. So let's take a look. The Germans, they joined in, and they joined in with us helping clear the Red Sea. Let's take a look. How's that operation going? Just in, the German frigate Hessen mistakenly fired at a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Red Sea on Monday. Both missiles malfunctioned and fell into the seas. So you have Germany. They're out there making the Red Sea safe for democracy and freedom. They see a U.S. drone. They fire 2 missiles on it. Thankfully, both missiles were no good, and they fell into the sea. And here's an update. New problems, according to media reports. There are no more missiles in German depots for 2 of the 3 types this frigate can fire. So he fired both of his missiles, and there aren't any more in Germany for them to have. So that is the extent of the German operation in the Red Sea. I don't know what they're going to do. They don't have missiles. Maybe they'll just wave their hands very aggressively and scare the Houthis off. Who knows? But anyway, here's the lesson for today. The experts, at least in the foreign policy area, are dumb, but they keep advancing by being dumb. And trying to maintain a global military empire is also dumb and dangerous. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for tuning in.